What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today's video is going to be a discussion of the string and numerical data types within C#. So today's video is going to be the second video in our Introduction to C# tutorial series, and if you are a complete beginner to C#, like you still need help downloading Microsoft Visual Studio or any IDE, knowing what to install and how to open your first console.net app, then I recommend you check out the first video on the channel. Otherwise, we're going to get into some pretty beginner C# concepts in this video. I hope you enjoy it. So to start with, I always just inside my function, I'll put this write line, read line, because those are pretty typical input and output instructions. But to get started, I just want to create a string variable. So we talked a little bit about variables in the first video, but if this is your first time seeing this, that's fine too. So to define a new variable and define it as a string, you start by typing the word string, and then you type the name of the variable that you want it to have. I'm going to call my string, and then you set an equal sign, and then you use the two quotation marks to identify that it's going to be a string. And this is an important difference between C# and like Python, because in Python, single quotes and double quotes, it doesn't make a difference. It does in C#. If you use single quotations, it's a character and you can only put one letter or number in there. But if it is a two quotations, then it's a full string and you can have as many text letters as you need. And so inside the quotations, you can put your text. So I'll just say Pete rocks, because that's good text. And so now if I'm going to go ahead and use my write line, I'm just going to display my string, and then the read line is only here to slow the program down so that we can actually display it. But if I go ahead and run this, we get Pete rocks on the console window. Okay, so that's great. And if I were to hit enter, then that's going to finish the read line and then our code is going to close, or you can hit the X, whatever. But so this is just me putting in a variable because it's easier. You could also, Pete does not rock, you can also type a string directly in the write line output. And so if I were to run this, you'll see we're not using my string anymore. We're just using that text directly. That's valid too, but a lot of the concepts I want to show you in this video are going to require a variable, your string being stored somewhere. So we're going to go ahead and put it in my string. And I think the next thing I want to talk about are just a couple special characters. So if you want a new line, so say I wanted rocks to be on a second line, it's \n, and you should see if you're using Visual Studio, and if you still have it on default text editor settings, which I would recommend for beginners, when you do \n, it turns yellow because it's a special character. But so now if I run this, we get Pete, and then we get rocks on the next line. And that's because \n is our new line special character. A couple other things, if you want a quotation mark, so if I wanted Pete to be in quotation marks, well, the problem is it thinks that a quotation is either the start or end of a string. So what you do is \, again, and then quotation marks, and then you would do the same thing at the end. So \, quotation marks, and that should turn yellow as well. It's just a special identifier saying take this thing that normally would not just be a string character and make it a string character. And so the last one I want to touch on since we're here is if you want a \, you do two \/ straight, just like that, and that's going to write just one \/ onto the screen. Okay, so those are all kind of special cases. You may want quotations, you may need a \, and you may need a new line at some point. So those are just good to know. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is concatenation. So if I were to make a second string, I'll call it second string. And in this one, I will say, but not that much. Now, I have these two strings, and if I want to display them both, I can do it a couple different ways. And the easiest one is just where I'm displaying the first string, use this plus, and then type in second string. And this is called string concatenation. So anytime you combine multiple strings, it's called concatenating your strings. That's just what it's called. You can call it string combining if you want. And what you'll see is they actually smush right together because we don't have a space built into that. So what you could do is you could put a space at the end of one string, or you could put a space at the start of the second string. Either way, it kind of looks weird just on its own. So what else you could do is you could do a plus and then two quotations and then just a space. And this is you manually inserting a space character into your string concatenation. But now you can see it looks good. Okay, so that's a little bit about string concatenation. That's a little bit about strings in general, but now let's start looking at things that you can use with strings. So everything we're about to use is called a method. So it's like a built-in string manipulation or analysis tool that C# and Visual Studio have built in. So the first method I'm going to talk about is length. So if I type in my string, which is Pete Rocks, and I do dot and then length, and you'll actually see right away when you put in a string and then a period, you see if you're using an IDE like Visual Studio, a good modern one, it shows you all of the built-in methods that you can use to manipulate strings. So we're just going to do a few simple ones today, a few common ones. But you can always scroll through there and look. If you're looking for a more advanced function, good chance that it shows up in there. So the first one we're going to show is just my string dot length. And that's all you have to do right there. And what you're going to see is it's going to tell us how many characters are in this string. So this is 5, and it should show us 10, I think. There we go. So it shows us 10, and that's because space counts as a character. But one thing I want to show you, if you have those special characters, so like \n for a new line, this will still work. It's just going to tell you 11, and you may notice we added a \, and an n, and it only added one character. That's because \n is considered one character. So is \quote, \. They're all special characters, but in terms of length, it's just viewing that as one character. So that's the dot length. A lot of the times you can use this in things like a password checker to make sure you meet the minimum length requirements, things like that. Okay, so the next thing I will talk about, the next method, is if you want to make sure you have a specific case. So let's say instead of Pete Rocks, this was Lemaster Tech, okay? And I'll get rid of this second string for now because we're not using it. So if you had something where you wanted to pass all of the string in, but you want it to be all uppercase, there's a built-in method for that. It's string.toUpper, like that, and then you need to add parentheses right there. And so if I go ahead and run this, you'll see we get Lemaster Tech, all caps. That's pretty good. And you probably could guess there's also toLower, just like that. And that's going to give us Lemaster Tech, all lowercase. Great. So that's toUpper, toLower. And then the next thing is you can check if a string contains a subset of that string. So I'm going to go ahead and just say, let's say it was checking just for Lemaster. And this is going to return just a true false. So there you see we get true because it's in Lemaster Tech. But a couple things about this. If it is case sensitive, so if you were to check Lemaster spelled that way, it's going to say false even though those letters are in there. So what you could do is you could combine something like toUpper and the contains statement to kind of combine these operations. So you could say contains and then toUpper of my string and then all caps Lemaster if you don't care about case. But just know that this is case sensitive. And then it's also, if you were to say, well, Lemaster's in there, but Lemasters is not, then it'll still tell you false. It needs to see everything that you put inside of this is in there. Okay, so that's useful. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the index of individual characters. So if you have my string and you want to look up specific character, you use these square brackets and then you put in the character that you want to see. So let's say I'm trying to get a hold of this capital M. The counting actually starts from 0, not 1. So L, even though it's the first letter, its index location is 0. If you're familiar with software or programming concepts, the first bit, the first location of anything is typically referred to as a 0, not a 1. So actually counting up 0, 1, 2 would give us the capital M. So let's go ahead and run that. And you can see we get a capital M on the screen. Okay, so that's indexing. You can index anything. I'll index 5 here and we'll get a lowercase t. So that's it can just be useful sometimes to look up the first character of a string or anything like that when you don't care about actually the whole string. All right, so another thing, since we're talking about the indexes, is you can use this concept index of, and then you can look up where an actual substring exists. So let's say we want to know when the word tech starts, okay? So it's going to tell you the index of wherever it shows up inside of your thing. So tech starts at the 9th character, which if we count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 is the space, 9 is the capital T. It gives us a 9. That's great. Something to note, if you have multiple of a letter though, so like lowercase e, there's 3 of them, it's always going to give you the first index. So once it finds your letter, it's going to just give you that value and then leave. So that's the index of. It's pretty useful. And so let's go ahead and talk about the substring now. So this is another very common method. And what you do here is you use that index value. And if you only put one value in, what it's going to do is it's going to go to that index. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to go to S. And that's just going to give you the remainder of the string starting from there. So you can see we get STER space tech. But there's a second thing you can do with the substring, which is you can also give it a length. So let's say we want it to be 6 characters long. If we go in now, we just get STER space capital T. So this is how you grab a portion of your string without modifying the whole string, and that's the dot substring method. Okay, so these are a bunch of really useful string concepts that it's just great to know. But we're going to go ahead and move on and talk about number concepts now because it's very similar. So as we talked about in the previous video, but if you don't remember, that's okay. So if you use int, that's a whole number integer value. So that has to be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12. Doesn't matter. Has to be a whole number. It can be negative. It can be 0, but it can't have decimal places. If you do want to use decimal places, there is float, decimal, and double. I recommend just sticking with double for all common, especially beginner concepts, really accurate numbers. A double is going to be fine for you. And so for a double, you can say, we'll say my number because we're going to get rid of integer. For a double, you can have decimals. You can say 32.54, things like that. And actually, so I'm going to go ahead and get those console.writeLine and read lines back. Console.writeLine, console.readLine. Just because most of what we're talking about gets a lot better if we can display it on the screen. So just like before, you could just you can just put a number in your write line and show that on the screen. And if I run this, it works fine. It shows me 35.8. But it's typically, if you're using the number somewhere in your function in your program, you're going to want it in a variable because that way you can actually store it somewhere. Okay, so we're going to talk about a lot of the methods underneath numbers now because it's not exactly the same. There are a few things that you can do after if you press dot, but mostly it's like comparing and to string and checking for equals, and those are actually not as important when you're dealing with numbers as mathematical operations are. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a second here, console.writeLine, because we're going to come back to my number and we're going to use it a few times, but I'm going to do a console.writeLine and type in capital M-A-T-H math. So that is like the math module inside of C# and Visual Studio. And if you use a period after that, you're going to see tons of common mathematical functions. You've got trigonometric things like cosine, sine, and tangent, logarithmic functions, exponential functions. We're going to talk about some of the most common ones real quick. So One of the ones that pops up all the time is ABS, and that's just absolute value. So if you're familiar with an absolute value, it takes whatever your value is and it gives you the positive return of that. So if I put minus 17 in here, you can see we just get positive 17. It also works on mathematical operations. So if we had like minus 17 times 2, so that's negative 34, it's going to do the math for us, 34, and give us the absolute value. And I should have mentioned that here as well. So like my number plus 12, it can do this math just built in intrinsically, and you're going to see even though our number was 32.54, it adds 12 to it and displays 44.54. Okay, so you can do plus, minus, multiplication is the star, and then division is the forward slash. You can do any of those right in this statement, or you can do something like double and then my math number, or I don't know, call it whatever you want. But you could intermediate, you could save the value of the operation that you're doing into an intermediate variable. So if you wanted my number divided by 11, you could store it in my math number, and then you could display my math number. Okay, so that's going to be like just shy of 3, 2.958. So this is another way of doing it. You could just do this math if it's not too complex, write in your write line statement or write in your output, wherever. Or you can store it in an intermediate variable. This is probably a little bit cleaner. In general, having a variable to store your math is a good place to do it. Okay, so that was just a little tangent. Let's go ahead and just change this back to my number. And I'm going to keep showing you some methods inside the math module. So another super common one is pow, which is basically raise a number to a power. So let's say something that we can verify. We want to raise 2 to the 4th power, okay? All you do inside of the pow function is you say what number it is that you're putting an exponential value on, and then what power you're raising it to. So 2 to the 4th is 16. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, okay? That was quick math. But so this also works with decimal values. So 2.4 to the 4th would still work just fine. It also works on, I believe, negative exponential values. So yeah, 2.4 to the negative 4th is 0.03. Who knew? So yeah, this works with negative exponentials. It works with decimal values. The pow function is super useful and pops up all the time. Next, Sqrt is square root. So that's just giving you a square root of a number. It's the kind of the opposite of the pow. And so there you can see square root of 36 is 6. Sqrt, we'll do min, max, and round next, and then we'll actually get into some fun like code. So min is a useful one for returning the lesser of two values, and this can be decimals or integers or I believe a mix. So yeah, you'll see if I put in min between 12 and 89.5, it's going to tell me like the minimum is 12. But if I take this exact same line and I change that min to max, it should tell us, well, 89.5 is your max value. So there you go. Min and max, there's a ton of times inside of Python, C#, inside of Visual Studio and C#, where you're actually going to be comparing multiple values, selecting the larger or the smaller of the two to continue with. So that's a super useful concept. And then the last method I want to talk about inside of the math module is just round. And you're probably familiar with like standard rounding rules for your function, but let's say you had 17.9845. So obviously that's pretty close to 18. You would expect it to round, and there you go, to 18. If you put it right at 17.5, it is going to round down. 17.5, round it up. Okay, make me a liar code. Let's see, 17.49 rounds down. Okay, interesting, because I swear I had 17.5 earlier, rounded down. That's cool. If you have 17.5, it's going to round up every time. Okay, so the round function, super useful to know. I believe if you do a comma and then you put an integer there, you can select how many decimal points you want it to round to. So it doesn't have to round to a whole number. So if you have 17.523 and you want to keep 2 decimal points, it'll round to that second decimal point. If you had like, something goofy and you want to round to 4 decimal points, you can do that just by adding a comma, adding a second argument. So that's super useful in actually like grabbing the amount of data that you have a level of confidence in. And that is really, those are the most key things I wanted to talk about inside of the math module. So let me just say 2 more things about like built-in functions that are going to speed up your programming. So there's a way to increment your number without having to do the long form of this, which would be my number equals, and then whatever my number currently is, plus 1. Okay, and what you'll see, because we've got 32.54 here, that's going to give us 33.54, which is what we want, but there's a faster way, and it would just be my number plus plus. And you're going to use this all the time for things in like for loops and integer while loops as like an incrementer value. So you'll see there, just by changing it to plus plus, it still gives us plus 1, and that's a lot faster than plus. My number equals my number plus 1. And then obviously the inverse of this, you can do minus minus, and that's going to negate 1. So it'll go from 32.54 to 31.54. Okay, so super good to know all of these things about numbers. One quick thing, if you do have a double and an integer, so I'll call this one whole number and it's equal to 3, and you multiply the 2 together, or you divide them or you add them or anything, if you have an integer and a decimal number and you combine them, it's always going to give you an output of the double. It's always going to give you the decimal, the more accurate value. So 97.62 when you multiply the 2 together. But a really important thing to know is if you have 2 integers and you do something that should give you a decimal value. So let's say my number divided by whole number, right? 13 divided by 3 should be like 4 and a third, so 4.333. Because we're using 2 integers, it's not going to give us an integer out, a decimal output. It's going to give us an integer output. So the way around that is just make one of them, instead of an integer, make one of them a double, and that way you just do 3.0, or you could do, I think you can do 3, and it's still going to give you a decimal answer. So you don't have to type this 0.0 in. You can if you want to remind yourself it's not an integer anymore. But yeah, so there's that super useful tip. The last thing I want to talk about, the modulus operator or modulo operator, one of those. It's basically division, but then checking for the remainder. So it's basically a remainder operator. So 13 divided by 3 is 4 with a remainder of 1. If I run this, it gives us a 1. Now 14 divided by 3 is still 4, but now the remainder is 2. So if I show that, it gives us the remainder of 2. There's a whole bunch of times in programming you're going to want to make sure that one number fits evenly into another number. So in that case, you would check that something was essentially like division. You'd check that the modulus was equal to 0. That's how you could make sure something divides evenly into something else. Okay, so this was a crash course in strings and a crash course in numerical data types, and I hope you found it useful. And if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. If you did find it useful, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a ton. And the next step in our tutorials, we're going to take everything that we've learned and talked about and turn it into like a 4-function calculator. So stay tuned for that. Be on the lookout for it. And that's really going to be the next step in learning C#. So thanks so much for watching, and good luck with your code. Thanks. Bye.